Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Neilo. I'm your host, Neilo Sullivan. If this is your first time joining us, we cover a range of topics, and you can check out all of our past episodes on our blog at pwneilo.com or follow Perspectives with Neilo wherever you get your podcasts. On February 16th and 17th, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited Ireland. Mr. Wang is the second senior Chinese official to visit Ireland in just over a year, following a visit by Premier Li Qiang in January of 2024. Many are curious as to why such senior Chinese Communist Party officials would take the time to visit a small country like Ireland. And as many experts have noted, senior Chinese official visits never happen without a reason. In this episode, we'll take a closer look at the circumstances surrounding the latest visit and what factors could be prompting this uptick of interest in Ireland. Many of the academics and experts we've talked to on the podcast in the past all agree that the Chinese Communist Party has become more authoritarian at home and more aggressive abroad under the current leader, Xi Jinping. For example, China now has border disputes with 13 of its neighbours and claims over 1.3 million square miles of the South China Sea in direct defiance of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. China has grown its military capabilities significantly across land, sea and air in the last decade. China has also built a strong partnership with Russia and has failed to directly condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In fact, trade between China and Russia has increased significantly since the beginning of the war, with the US and others accusing China of supplying dual-use items to Russia to ramp up their defence industrial base. Meanwhile, post-pandemic, China's economy has slowed substantially. The property sector has all but collapsed, and local governments are straining under debt burdens. Unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, is high, so much so that the government has suspended reporting the numbers. Along with this, consumer confidence is poor, and exports are the one thing propping up China's economy, which doesn't really inspire confidence, as Western governments consider protectionist measures against what they regard as unfair trade practices by China. In January of 2024, Chinese Premier Li Qiang visited Ireland. He met with then Taoiseach Leo Varadkar and with President Higgins. On his visit, he announced the reopening of the Chinese market for Irish beef sales and also visa-free travel to China for Irish citizens. Shortly after that visit, we spoke with Professor Alexander Dukalski of UCD to dive a little deeper into the details and understand the significance of the statements and commentary surrounding it. I'd highly recommend you go back and listen to that episode, which is entitled Ireland's Knowledge Deficit on China, if you haven't already done so. It's a little surprising then that just over 1 year later, another very senior Chinese Communist Party official would make a visit to Ireland. As mentioned in our introduction, Chinese official visits never happen without a reason. So who is Wang Yi and what brings him to Ireland? Wang Yi is a very senior member of the Political Bureau of the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee and has been China's Minister for Foreign Affairs since 2013. In this time, he has made over 70 trips to Europe, but this is his first visit to Ireland. On this trip, he also stopped in the UK and attended the 61st Munich Security Conference. Wang Yi has become known as the campaigner for the global ambitions of China's leader Xi Jinping, particularly because Xi has scaled back his foreign visits since the start of the pandemic. Under Wang Yi, China's diplomatic approach has become more assertive, often referred to as Wolfwarriordiplomacy, where Chinese diplomats are more vocal in defending China's interests and pushing back against international criticism. Wang Yi has been a staunch proponent of the claim that Taiwan is part of the People's Republic of China, even though the CCP have never controlled or occupied Taiwan for even a second in their entire existence. He has also worked to align Muslim countries with Beijing to push back against Western criticisms of its mass detention of the Uyghur Muslim minority. China's Foreign Ministry said in a press release that Wang's visit to Ireland was at the invitation of the Taoiseach and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Simon Harris. In contrast, the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs said that the visit was taking place at the request of the Chinese government. During the visit to Dublin, Wang Yi met with Taoiseach Simon Harris and also had a courtesy call with the Taoiseach Micheál Martin. In the readout of the meeting with the Taoiseach Simon Harris, the official Department of Foreign Affairs statement said that, quote, "The relationship with China is one that we value. We had detailed and constructive exchanges on a wide range of issues. Both Ireland and the EU more broadly have a comprehensive economic relationship with China. I stressed our interest in maintaining and strengthening that relationship on the basis of the global multilateral trading system with transparent, equitable and mutually agreed parameters and a level playing field. I also took the opportunity to raise a number of trade issues of importance to Ireland and requested that the Chinese authorities allow the resumption of access for Irish beef to China." End quote. While Irish beef exports to China did resume after Li Qiang's visit in January of 2024, they were again suspended following discovery of an apparent case of atypical BSE in October. Irish beef exports to China were worth almost €40 million in 2019, before the previous suspension. It wasn't clear from the Irish government statement on the visit if the Chinese embargo on dairy products from the EU introduced last August was discussed. China launched an anti-subsidy probe into dairy imports from the European Union after the EU voted for tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in October of 2024. The European Commission has already launched a challenge at the World Trade Organization against China's probe, the first time it has taken such action at the start of an investigation, rather than waiting for it to result in trade measures against the EU. Ireland is also one of the few European countries to have a trade surplus with China. However, the majority of that trade in recent years has been pharmaceutical products, electrical machinery and electronics, with beef and dairy products being a very small percentage by comparison. The Irish government's post-meeting statement also mentioned that issues on higher education links between our two countries were also discussed at the meeting between Simon Harris and Wang Yi. Additional detail was not provided, but given what we've previously heard about the presence of Confucius Institutes on Irish university campuses and the fact that the Irish Department of Education was willing to enlist the help of the Chinese Ministry of Education to provide Mandarin Chinese teachers for Irish schools, it would appear that some naivety or lack of awareness of the Chinese Communist Party still persists among Irish government officials. The Irish government post-meeting statement also alluded to the planned EU-China summit for later in 2025 and stated that, quote, "We hope that further progress can be made on issues such as digital, trade, the environment, human rights and other topics," end quote. Which brings us to the subject of human rights. In advance of Wang Yi's visit, the Irish Uyghur Cultural Association and Hong Kongers living in Ireland sent an open letter to the Irish government calling on the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach to adopt a human rights-based approach in their discussions with the Chinese Foreign Minister and to demand concrete actions with respect to acts of transnational repression, genocide and politically motivated imprisonment perpetrated by the People's Republic of China. The letter went on to request urgent attention to the pattern of Chinese state surveillance and harassment of members of the diaspora communities residing in Ireland, and explicitly stated that members of the Uyghur, Hong Kong, Tibetan and Taiwanese communities do not feel safe after years of settling in Ireland. Overall, the letter is quite detailed and raises important questions. Therefore, we plan to return to it in a future episode. Taoiseach Simon Harris, in his statement after his meeting with Wang Yi, responded that, quote, "Ireland's engagement with China is embedded in the global multilateral system, and this framed our exchange today. In my conversation with the Foreign Minister, I underlined the centrality of the UN Charter and the institutions and bodies of the UN to Ireland's foreign policy. I set out Ireland's long-held concerns around the human rights situation in China, particularly around the national security law in Hong Kong and the treatment of minorities in Xinjiang and elsewhere. I emphasised Ireland's long-held view that all human rights issues of concern should be comprehensively discussed and examined within the UN human rights architecture." End quote. And while it's a positive thing that the Irish government are willing to voice their concerns about China's human rights abuses and in the past have taken action to shut down an illegal Chinese police station on Capel Street in Dublin, it also should be noted that when in August of 2022, the UN Human Rights Office, under Commissioner Michelle Bachelet, released a report that accused China of what it called international crimes and in particular crimes against humanity, the Chinese government strongly denied all allegations of human rights abuses and adopted an intransigent attitude. Listeners may not be surprised then to hear that the readout of the Dublin meeting on Chinese state media outlet Xinhua made no mention whatsoever of any discussions on human rights. In fact, the Chinese Communist Party views all questions of human rights abuses in China as interference in its internal affairs. The situation in Ukraine was also discussed by Taoiseach Simon Harris and Minister Wang Yi. On this, Simon Harris said that he, quote, asked that China use its influence on Russia to end their illegal invasion of Ukraine. Any peaceful solution to the war in Ukraine must be based on the UN Charter and must respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. There can be no discussion about the future of Ukraine without Ukraine. End quote. It would have been interesting to hear Wang Yi's response to this statement. After all, many analysts suspect that the reason Russia has been able to sustain their offensive effort in Ukraine for so long is due in large part to support from China. According to official data published by China's General Administration of Customs, trade between China and Russia reached a record high in 2024, with combined imports and exports hitting almost $245 billion. In fact, according to OEC data, China provided Russia with a massive 53% of its imports in 2023, way up from around 25% in 2021. The huge diversion to Chinese-made goods largely replaces European exports. Back in 2021, EU countries plus the UK accounted for over a third of Russian imports. By the end of 2023, the figure had fallen to less than 20%. But China's support for Russia goes well beyond day-to-day trade. Back in April of 2024, former US Secretary of State in the Biden administration, Antony Blinken, warned that China must stop powering Russia's war in Ukraine. He made his remarks at a press conference after meetings with Chinese President Xi Jinping and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, indicating that China was supplying microelectronics, chemicals for munitions, and rocket propellants and dual-use items to Russia that they were using to ramp up their defense industrial base. Chinese leaders have denied providing weapons to Ukraine, and during Blinken's trip, they gave no indication that his warning would be heeded. China's relationship with Russia also brings to mind a previous podcast episode we released back in May of 2023 entitled Wolfwarrior Peace Brokering. In that episode, I spoke with Swedish journalist Johe Olsson about comments made by the then Chinese ambassador to France, Liu Xiaoye. Liu Xiaoye has become infamous for what French publication Le Monde called his vehement, even aggressive rhetoric towards Western countries. In April of 2023, he drew the ire of many when he commented in an interview on French television that Crimea belongs to Russia and that former Soviet states lack legitimacy. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs quickly retracted the statement. However, unlike other Chinese diplomats or officials who have stepped out of line, Liu Xiaoye was not recalled or disappeared. In fact, after 5 controversial years as China's ambassador to France, Liu Xiaoye has recently been promoted to the Chinese government's special representative for European affairs, a surprising development at a time when relations between Beijing and Brussels have been under strain from trade disputes and China's ongoing support of Russia. Liu Xiaoye's latest promotion would appear to reinforce China's persistent support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, an invasion which China has never condemned. And staying with the topic of new appointments, China has also appointed a new ambassador to Ireland in recent months. His name is Zhao Xiyuan, and he presented his credentials to President Michael D. Higgins in early February. He replaces He Xiandong, whose last hurrah would appear to have been his complaint to the Oireachtas about Irish senators visiting Taiwan. We will be closely watching to see if Zhao Xiyuan behaves in a similar fashion to his predecessor. Another new appointment since China's last official visit in January of 2024 is Ireland's new government administration. And while the two main political parties in the administration remain the same, it has been commented that one reason for Wang's visit could be to try and keep the new administration on side. But perhaps the most impactful new appointment of all is the inauguration of President Donald Trump in his second term as President of the United States of America. Analysts have pointed to the geopolitical volatility caused by the return of President Trump, and many have predicted choppy waters ahead for Ireland's trade and investment-oriented economy. This has been noted as one of the reasons for Wang Yi's visit to Ireland at this time. That is, to exploit the current uncertainty in US trade policy and to shore up what China sees as positive partners within Europe who may be vulnerable to changes in US policy. China may also be attempting to recruit Ireland's support in reopening EU trade discussions on the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, or CAI, which was put on ice as EU-China relations worsened previously. The CAI was drafted in 2020, but mothballed after China sanctioned members of the European Parliament over their criticism of China's human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. In recent weeks, EU President Ursula von der Leyen has signalled a willingness to engage with Beijing, a potential repositioning as a result of Trump's protectionist agenda. China may regard Ireland as a relatively safe space, where such matters can be discussed in a less combative way than in other EU capitals. The fact that a respected EU member state like Ireland is militarily neutral and a non-NATO country could be seen as positives in the eyes of Beijing. China's state media outlet Xinhua, in their readout of the meeting, did say that, quote, Ireland is willing to play a constructive role in promoting dialogue and cooperation between the EU and China, end quote. Meanwhile, China is also working to renew diplomatic relations with the UK as the new Labour government seeks a different tone on China in light of its economic and diplomatic challenges. No mention is made in any Irish government statements as to whether China's ratcheting up of grey warfare tactics and military aggression against the democratic country of Taiwan was discussed with China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi. In 2024, more than 3,000 Chinese military planes flew into Taiwan's de facto air defence identification zone. This amounts to almost double the number of incursions of the previous year. The People's Liberation Army, or PLA, who are the military wing of the Chinese Communist Party, have targeted Taiwan with waves of harassment and intimidation, using anything from weather balloons to aircraft carriers. In addition, non-military tactics, including legal and cyber warfare, disinformation campaigns, and the weaponization of diplomatic and trade relationships, are all par for the course with the CCP. As we mentioned earlier and reported in a recent episode entitled Taiwan, Ireland and Wolf Warrior Interference, even the Chinese ambassador to Ireland is reported to have complained to the Oireachtas, or Irish Parliament, when 5 Irish senators visited Taiwan back in July. One might expect that Ireland's foreign minister would at least express his disapproval with this kind of interference and show some support towards Taiwan, given Ireland's similar past history with a very powerful neighbour. Both Ireland and Taiwan share a common struggle in asserting their sovereignty while fostering global support, leveraging their unique identities and cultivating resilience in the face of external threats. Let's hope that this point is not lost on Ireland's present political representatives. Ireland has been fortunate over the past few decades that its low tax regime and highly educated workforce has drawn a range of international companies to set up their EU headquarters here. These include US companies like Google, Intel, Apple and Pfizer, and Chinese firms like Huawei, TikTok, Temu and Shine. While this has served Ireland well so far, some experts are cautioning that this is a situation that could put Ireland in the crossfire of a superpower trade war. Equally concerning is that while the US took the lead in driving a rules-based international order since the end of World War II, that is one where countries abide by established norms and treaties on trade and territorial integrity, Donald Trump has spent his first weeks in office effectively discrediting this system. Many analysts have commented that this is opening the door for Beijing to rewrite the rules-based international order in its own interests. China has, for example, long sought to shift the emphasis from liberal universal values based on individual freedoms to the alternative rights of development and economic prosperity. Trump's desires on territorial expansion, like acquiring Greenland, the Panama Canal, and turning Gaza into an American resort, could also be a green light for China to advance its own expansionist agenda. Its ongoing quest to control the South China Sea, as well as annexing Taiwan and other territories along the first island chain. Given Donald Trump's erratic and unpredictable behaviour, it's no wonder then that traditional allies in Europe are left confused and reeling, wondering what Washington has in store for them next. It's not difficult to see how some EU leaders may soften their tone or become more receptive to dealing with China. However, when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party, Western nations would do well to remember that leopards do not change their spots. In the current climate of uncertainty, perhaps it would be more prudent to prioritise core values of freedom, democracy and respect for human rights above short-term trade benefits or appeasing dictators and their followers. To quote a former US Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, principled leadership is not defined by the political moment, but by the ability to stand for what is right, even when it is hard. If you'd like to find out more about the topics discussed in this episode, we've placed information and links in the Dive Deeper section of our blog, which you can find at pwneilo.com. That's pwneilo.com. We've also included links to our previous podcasts that we referred to in this episode. And finally, we'd like to ask a favour. Recently, we've noticed that many of our listeners are not subscribed. So if you enjoyed this episode and you don't want to miss any future episodes, we'd really appreciate it if you could hit that subscribe button on your favourite podcast app. This is the best way to support us and really helps motivate us to keep producing content. Please also feel free to comment and let us know what you think of these topics. But that's where we leave it for now. Thank you for listening, and until the next time, Slán agus beannacht.